Al equipo técnico, ¿comenzamos? ¿Podemos ya? Bueno, continuamos con el...
Well, we're continuing with the Commission of Solidarity of the Fifth Conference for the Balance of the World, as we had.
La participación de Johanna Tablada, subdirectora de la...
We have the participation of Johanna Tablada, the subdirector of the Direction of the United States of Foreign Relations Ministry. She's going to make a presentation about the relationship between Cuba and the United States. After she finishes her presentation, she is going to receive questions or any questions or doubts that you may have. Good afternoon. As it is difficult for us to speak little, but I'll try and make my effort. Fernando was telling me, can you speak in only half an hour? But I am bringing a PowerPoint. Very simply speaking, is trying to demonstrate that the policy of the United States towards Cuba, even though we're going to give details, we could describe today as a policy that continues to be directed to choke, asphyxiate these public services, economy, to affect our population and then blame us for that. We are, all those of us who know what the Cuban population has suffered for the last for 60 years, but especially in the last 5 years. If we were to look for three main aspects of these policies since 1959, precisely, the pillars of that policies, economic, commercial, and financial of the United States, they are still alive as the first day. The campaigns of discredit and misinformation and digital operations for destabilizing Cuba, and what we can call the political subversion, which is linked to the this influence in Cuban internal policy, as that they have not been able to achieve that the majority of the Cuban people will support this process to do away with the Cuban revolution. That so they devise all kinds of they take the favorite Cubans who live in the United States, and they use all kinds of campaigns. In the last few years, many Cubans have left Cuba, but definitely many of the people who are leaving Cuba is not that they do not like the social justice project of Cuba. It's because we are exhausted in this permanent war from the United States. When we ask people, why do you leave? Because I don't want to stand in line since 4 o'clock in the morning. But the policy of the United States is to impose a number of measures, very hard measures, completely illegal, immoral, untenable, and then say, oh, the Cubans are having a hard time. So this is another, we're going to putting it very simply to organize our presentation of how we see things. Nowadays, I don't have to tell you that in the last few times, you see that there is a certain movement in the bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States. Then we could say that this movement have been placed first in an increase of official and bilateral exchange, which are perceptible changes, but they are not substantial. Very discrete advances in conversations and collaboration, but we say discrete because they have been over a number of measures that is part of what they were trying they said that they were trying to lift the blockade, but they have not done anything. That is, they maintain the blockade, and the three pillars are still there. We're also leaving the reopening of official spaces of dialogue between the governments of Cuba and the United States in areas that have to do principally with interests, with national interests of both countries, and principally of the interest of the United States. And this doesn't mean that we do not come to a conversation. When we speak with the government of the United States of these topics, we also speak of the issues that are crucial for us, because Carlos Fernandez de Cosio was saying in a speech that is online, you can access it, in December 1922, the relationship between Cuba and the United States very fast. She's, please, come on. Yes, please. Yes, mercy, please. Another aspect that marks and defines the relationships is their process that are not happening in Cuba, but they have an impact on the Cuban bilateral relations. Polarization, the signs of fascist tendencies in the United States, in the policy of the United States, and this polarization that occurs in this country is also influenced by the narrative, the public debates, and everything that has to do with the debate on Cuba, led precisely in two areas. First, in the coherence of the policy of the United States against Cuba beyond discourse. If you make a psychological exercise and sociological and journalistic exercise, the government of the United States says once and again that the priority of the policy towards Cuba is to help the Cuban people. And they also say with the second priority, as a second priority, that that's what the Biden says, and the Department of State and the embassy says that. That is, they do not blush by saying that. So they also say that promoting human rights in Cuba is their second priority. And supporting the Cuban people. These are the pillars of what they say, but the gap between the political discourse of the United States and reality of the everyday actions of the financing, where their finances go, where the personnel that works for the Cuban topic in all the aspects of the Cuban government are directed towards the opposite, is to persecute us, to persecute any incomes that our economy may have, any public service. They are directed to fabricate lies and pretexts to justify these policies that they say, if you remember John Bolton, he said the maximum pressure towards Cuba. And one that is coming out also is Mauricio Claver Caron, who was the supervisor of security, and we say insecurity towards Latin America. It's an accusation together with Marco Rubios and all these anti-Cubans who continue with this policy of not allowing, that is, to maximum pressure means taking measures that design to the source of any income that may be generated towards the Cuban economy and towards Cuban services. There are many friends here who have come to Cuba for many years, and they know that there are not enough medicines in our hospitals. Any other, that is, we have guaranteed our health in Cuba, but there are not resources, not available. Sometimes families and patients do not have the necessary drugs. It's not a failure of socialism, it's a failure of the government or of the Cuban public health that is given to anyone in the population, whether you live in the Sierra Maestra, whether you live in Havana or in Pinar del Rio, you're given social health here. But this scarcity that we have had to suffer recently are due to this design that euphemistically they say maximum pressure, but it is a deliberate plan associated to great lies. What is the basis of stopping incomes for Cuba in projects such as of cooperation, legitimately established with the United Nations in the South-South? Well, simply because they said that the Cuban doctors were slaves. How do you justify closing the Cuban the embassy of the United States here in Cuba, where they invented the twisted invention that if that they had attacked American diplomats here in Cuba, which is a complete lie. And there are still those who simply say that that was real, but that if so many people saying that that wasn't true, that it was, but they don't know what happened, but it was maybe have been natural causes or these symptoms. 5 years afterwards, they're saying that. So all the measures that were imposed on Cuba, they were so harsh associated to that accusation. Oh, I'm going away from my topic. We have also seen in this polarization the increase of the questioning on the world of the blockade against Cuba, and then I have tried to describe very superficially what is happening. So our gratitude is present to organizations such as many of you who participated in these campaigns to saying all kinds of things that we needed during the pandemics.
Muchas gracias en nombre propio, en nombre del Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores y de las personas del pueblo de Cuba por lo que han hecho todos los que están sentados aquí y muchos más para en medio de esa política rebelarse, ayudar a los cubanos, enviar medicamentos, denunciar en los países donde viven las mentiras tan grandes que se han utilizado para justificar una política que es inmoral. Aquí ya yo me adelanté, la política de Estados Unidos sobre la pandemia merece estudios científicos y académicos, porque es una política que se tipifica como genocidio. Si un país en medio de una crisis económica que es compartida por el resto del mundo, producto de la parálisis que provoca la COVID en el movimiento, en las cadenas de suministro, en el funcionamiento de los países. Si un país pequeño como Cuba, que tenía como particularidad que además de esa crisis por la pandemia, que además de esa presión inusual e inédita sobre los sistemas de salud del mundo, gracias teníamos el nuestro que no se hizo de un día para otro, era 30 años o muchos años ya en que el sistema de salud de Cuba destella como uno de los sistemas de salud más sofisticados y destacados del mundo. En ese momento, ¿cuál es la orden del presidente de Estados Unidos recién estrenado en el año 2021? Hay dos decisiones del gobierno de Estados Unidos que deben ser denunciadas una y otra vez. La primera fue registrar a Cuba como país terrorista. Y ustedes me dirán, pero esa decisión la toma el gobierno de Trump el 11 de enero del 2021, cuando todavía el presidente Biden no había llegado a la Casa Blanca.
President Biden had not arrived in the White House, but they had the discretionary power to do something else, because all the world, including the structures of the U.S. administration, knew that a country that is not terrorist should not be included in the list of terrorists. And somebody who promotes terrorism, we, on the contrary, have been a country who has been a victim of terrorism, and we have cooperated with the United States in certain cases, public cases even, to fight terrorism. So And this is something that gave an additional pressure against our society, against our economy. Earlier was asking me a while ago if we have data. There's one datum which is important of the Economic Division of Department of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. 2 months after deciding that we were to be included in this, more than 40 banks in the world told foreign enterprises in Cuba who had operations in Cuba that they could not continue working in Cuba. Imagine that in the midst of a pandemic. What happened? Two enterprises, German and Swiss, they immediately left us without the supplies, immediately stopped sending the supplies. Imagine all the amount of drugs that we need in our system. More than 40 drugs were absent, there was shortage. And there was another decision by the Biden administration. There were progressive sectors in the United States. He orders, there were organizations in United Nations. He orders the revision and the review of all the unilateral sanctions that the United States had in progress, and there were hundreds around the world, and to modify or change or suspend during the pandemic those, and that is a presidential order in the national security, as such it was announced, and to change those that would affect the capacity of the states to confront COVID. Do you understand that? So guess which was the only country that was not included in those that you had to lift the sanctions against. So there were people who understood that the people of Cuba, and only the people of Cuba, those that fought Ebola, those that offered doctors for Katrina, those that opened its international airports when the towers fell down, that was the only one that had to be excluded in the midst of a pandemic to be alleviated. And the one that has, for the shame of the United States, the unilateral systems applied for the longest term. The most sanctions for the longest term in time. So imagine what we all felt when we saw day after day how they were benefiting or profiting in the first semester of 2020. So they told Cuba, they said that because on the June 11 there were a number of people who were following their policies or their orders. So since very early in January, February, March or April, they were already benefiting from the pandemic to obtain a destabilization of Cuba, to make our health system collapse, to bring about a situation of desperation in the population. They have become dehumanized. They didn't care of the Cuban cost this would have. So anybody who knows about it will not forget it. We are not revengeful. This does not change our position that the only way out of the conflict is to understand each other. But it's something that is difficult to forget. It is something that is difficult to forget. I personally believe that we will never forget it. And it's good for the friends of Cuba to know this. So when they have to confront all the toxic lies and all the arguments and pretexts invented out of nothing to justify what is something that cannot be justified, to know really what was happening. These are the operations of disinformation. The greatest was during the summer of 2021, when the SOS Cuba was a trend in the world, and only 2% of the messages were originated here. There are experts, it's Antonio who knows, and he's an expert. But only 2% comes out of our country, but the rest is something that is fabricated. Not that we didn't have problems for people to feel bad, but at the same moment you can see any biopharma, many public presentations of Bio-Cuba Pharma, Cuba starts to have the vaccine essays, and this strategy, it was designed in the United States, failed. The victory was of our population, of the bet that Cuba betted, and there was a leadership here for public health, because of the importance of education, of a system of science that does not respond to money. It is at the service of the people and other peoples. And this is something that we won't forget ever. Because this demonstrates the capacity, the infinite capacity of the peoples to win when they unite and when they have the solidarity of people like those who are here, like you. What is the reason that we're going to talk of what's going to happen? Is what is happening now. So please somebody tell me how much time I have. Please go on. So now suddenly you say exchange of officials with that. I could not arrive here and not tell you that we are talking to the United States, that there have been 2 rounds of migratory discussions, that many things that were suspended by Trump came back thanks to the resistance of the Cuban people, betting on socialism and the greatness of solidarity. However, these are chapters of our history that are sometimes painful, because the 10,000 people who they wanted to come out to the street and to fight against the government of Cuba, many of them left the country. In the last 2 years, the amount of people of young people, of people who work, of people who produce, they have felt the pressure, and if they are choking because they have been asphyxiated, then they say it's only one life and I don't have to live it like this. So some people just crumbled and left. But this is one of the calculation errors of the United States, saying people are going to come out into the street and are going to topple the government. But many people just went to the southern front border. And this is a migratory increase that Cuba was not provoking. This is something provoked by them, by a policy that was mistaken and flawed, because they think that with pressure they can topple a true revolution. And then from 2022, we have had a change. There's a small change. So we have conversations about migration. Now they are reactivating exchange areas, applying the law. The U.S. administration validates the migration agreements that we had in 2017, which were good agreements, and reduced to 0 the illegal migration by the sea, because Cuba wants a migration that's sure, secure. So there are other areas that have been added. You can see them in the poster, and there have been exchanges and video conferences. We are neighboring countries, and I want to say clear, although I'm very passionate, that the policy of Cuba from Fidel to Diaz-Canel is the same one. We are not going to renounce to have a civilized relation with the United States, with respect for our independence and our sovereignty. We understand. The bilateral relations, I said about the rounds of conversation, In May, there are a number of measures that are going to be applied. The measures are there. In general, to make the travel flexible. A person 70 years old, for example, that wants to see their people in Santiago de Cuba had to come to Havana first and then to take a transportation to Santiago de Cuba. It's quite a long island and this may take even 24 hours. So the people in the United States were asking us, why do we have to go to Havana? It's not our problem, it's Trump's problem. Because they wouldn't let the planes land in Santiago de Cuba. They had all to land in Havana. The team that brought Trump to Cuba was the demolition team. The team of demolition, we called it for. That was Trump's envoys to Cuba. The pressure inside the United States of many sectors like those that are here, like those that are seated here, organizations that were seeing what was happening and they asked the U.S. administration to stop the pandemic and the pressure measures at the moment, at such a vulnerable moment in Cuba. Those emigres that were mobilized, universities, organizations of human rights.
And international community, the Summit of the Americas, and what they talked most about was Cuba. They shouldn't. That's behind. That's something that's been over. But then they include us in the terrorist list or countries that propitiate terrorism, and then they call us to the Summit of the Americas. And because there was a problem in Havana in 2022, there was someone who was dead in Havana, who died in Havana because of the blockade, and they were addressing these unconventional wars activities. These things should have never happened. And in the United States, there are dozens of people who have died in the streets and people who have died asking for free education access like we Cubans have. And they claim they need social justice as we Cubans have, and they have died for that. And diplomacy groups have tried to explain to them the other version, what the New York Times and the Washington Post do not say. No, this country functions, we work, but they say we don't function. And in the history of humanity, if you continue searching in the history of humanity, you see in Cuba that all children are at 7:30 a.m. They are out in the streets, all dressed up in their uniforms, going to school. That's something. It's very important. And we don't even are happy with that. We want more. But many countries are far from that, of meeting the demands and the needs of millions of their people. Now we have the situation of our policy is helping the Cuban policy. That's what they say. How do they explain that they have a non-terrorist country in the list of countries that favor terrorism? Because we had a delegation from Colombia, from the National Liberation Army of Colombia, because they requested to have the conversations, the negotiations for peace in our country. The Title III of the Helms-Burton Act froze year after year what the right they had to present lawsuits against us. The attacks against Cuban cooperation, not only with the Biden administration, but they have increased. You will find whole paragraphs specifically addressing this issue. There are Cuban doctors everywhere in your countries. They might be slaves, but you may be sanctioned by the U.S. government because you go to see Cuban doctors in your countries. The Cuban medical brigades were proposed for the Nobel Prize on Peace. There are many religious organizations that have been persecuted. They are trying to justify what there's no justification for it. They want to find a pretext to continue an asphyxiating policy that is rejected by the international community. I have one example here. I recommend a report Cuba submits in all languages to the United Nations, but one of the more outrageous things that only we Cubans suffer is Cuba cannot export to the United States, being so we can only import food from the United States, but we cannot export anything to any place in the United States because products and goods manufactured in countries that include components from the United States or substances from the United States cannot be imported into Cuba. Countries are forbidden to export those to Cuba. Cuba cannot use U.S. dollars in transactions with the world. They freeze our accounts in the United States, in other countries, even bank accounts in euros. Awards Cuban cannot cash. Remember, in July 2021, one of the greatest ideas in the United States, they had this brilliant idea. They say that we have internet access thanks to the United States. No, we have internet access in spite of the efforts from the United States or by the United States. They don't allow that Cuban engineers have tools or instruments or supplies or whatever because we cannot access information from the rest of the world. And even though Cuba has a great, an important role, plays an important role in all these things, it is my understanding that South American Brigade is in Cuba, and I know you have followed us for years, and I do appreciate what you've done. And we were very much moved that in the middle of all the problems we have and all we suffered, our friends reacted, even though they were suffering from hardships and scarcity, with so much solidarity and humanism. You should know that when more vulnerable the United States was, they didn't even respond to our request to buy oxygen to treat COVID patients or to buy components to manufacture and produce drugs against COVID or other diseases. I just want to summarize and saying that it's true that has been some progress regarding or compared to previous years. The Cuban policy is stable and it does respond to the needs of the Cuban people and the interests of the Cuban people. We don't have to lie to say that the Cuban policy is to let them know that they have to respect us. They have to respect our right to be sovereign, and the right to decide if we want to maintain our socialism or whatever. It's our right to decide what we want to do as an independent country. We will always be ready to support and to offer solidarity and to help other peoples. And what the persons or the people who have said that we have 20,000 troops in Venezuela is the United States. We can support a country in a war, but then, and when they discover that what they're being told is not true, that Cuba attacked Cuban U.S. diplomats, it's not true, that we are intervening or in the internal policy of any country like Venezuela. That's not true. But they don't mention, but we don't have people, miserable beggars in the streets or anything like that. We don't have murders by the policemen, by the thousand, or mass shootings. We don't have that freedom to kill anybody, but just to protect the rights of our people. We will not have that kind of society. Never. That will be our policy forever. Now, I want to end with a phrase, a sentence. The strength of our revolution will always lie in the ideas of Martí. That's what we were told. That's what we were taught. The strength to defeat or try to defeat our independent, sovereign, and socialist country or policy project is not Cuba, the country that banned travels to Cuba or that banned scientific exchange. That's what we have been taught, the value and strength of ideas. Thank you very much.
No, preguntas. Aplauso para el pueblo cubano. Él se lo merece todo.
Applause for the Cuban people who deserves everything. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're going to make me cry.
Muchas gracias por sus aplausos que nos llenan de cariño y no lo tomamos.
Your applauses are for the Cuban people, which is the protagonist of this story, heroic and revolutionary and solidarity. Questions, please. We thank Joanna before going to the questions. I know that you're going to, it would have been a crime to limit her to half an hour only, but she went over that, but it would have been a crime to limit her presentation. So questions, please.
Bueno, después de esta presentación.
After this presentation, I see that some friends want to answer questions. Let's see. Begin over here and then over there, and the one on the hat. So please go near a mic in order to use your time. Please say your name and organization, country. Roberto Medina from Dominican Republic, the Máximo Gómez Foundation. More than a question, it's a preoccupation. I have a concern. What we have heard here is marvelous, but I think that the friends of Cuba, we have to have a material where we can use, update, study this material, because anonymously we can, in the whole world, in many countries, they are defending Cuba, so it happens in the Dominican Republic, but it's not only, shouldn't be only from the Dominican Republic. So we don't have a material. We have a wide material on the Cuban blockade. We struggle to explain that, but we don't have a material. But I don't know any case in which they in the middle of the street, people are arguing against Cuba, and the ones who defend Cuba do not lose their fight. Thank you, brother. Over here, please. My name is Josefina Sanchez. I always introduce myself as a citizen of the world because I'm Cuban. I have an Austrian citizenship. I am married to a German person, and I live in France. I've known Joanna, and I love her very much. Her very emotional and the speech. There are many things I am worried. I've been here for 15 days here in Cuba, and I think that unfortunately everything has been changing here in Cuba. I am not very positive with all the changes. I am worried about old people who, when they have an appointment with a doctor, and I've seen old people who are have been for 3 hours in a bus stop waiting for a bus, and that's bad for them. I think that we can help that. I think that here we have the president of the Pastor for Peace that we met her in Washington for defending the freedom of the five. They have donated buses, but we can coordinate through all committees so that old people, some of them have been the fighters for Cuban, and I have offered to give them, to pay a taxi for them, and they have not accepted. To organize when they have an appointment for the doctor, to organize a bus for them. I was very much moved by these examples of people who are sick, who've been waiting for a bus for 3 hours for a doctor's appointment, back and forth. I am one of those who defend Cuba, and I follow Martí's ideas, but I think that humanity is number one, and I think we can bring a solution for that. I know that I've been working with these things. I've been working for this relationship with the United States, and sometimes I miss all these things. But I know that we are here in Cuba. There are organizations who try to give a priority to these aspects. Something very important, which I forgot, is that in the last few years, there is a medieval persecution against fuel for Cuba, and the only country that the ships and insurance companies are punished for bringing oil to Cuba, that's an invention from it is not even in the Helm Boosters Act. It is an additional measure, that is, we break our heads are trying to use renewable energies and all that, but sometimes there are buses that are electric, and they are selling motorcycles that are alternatives for public transportation, but only from the States. I think that we are trying to find alternatives, and sometimes directives that are not aware about these things, and people who drive cars from the state, and sometimes we have to call for the the awareness of directives who are driving their cars and do not pick up people from their bus stops. There are other social actors that we have to be aware of that and walk the streets and be aware of these things. Some of us do that. I sometimes stop at bus stops and pick people up. So I am criticizing myself, and I criticize other people who do not do that. This is not a criticism. It's something I'm asking for the help that we can solve. It is true that that is something that is an issue that we have to think hard on how to solve all these things. We are going to go forward with blockade and without blockade.
Le pedimos al resto de los compañeros que hagan directamente la pregunta.
Please ask your questions directly. Good afternoon. Very good presentation. It's what I wanted to hear, everything related to the blockade. So I've been educated very much with what you have said. I want to be briefly as a liking between Cuba and Puerto Rico, a contrast as to the migration. The similarities, the United States always use a beautiful name to do something evil. And in Puerto Rico, they passing the promise law, but this so-called promise law is not for the Puerto Rican people. It's a beautiful word. For those who speak English, is a fiscal control for the Puerto Rican people, and the government has no money to give the essential services for people. We have closed schools, there's the precariousness in the population, reduction of the pensions of public servants on a so-called promise law. Another thing is this contrast of the Cuban migration that the media are using. They say 400 people are stopped on a boat on the middle of the streets. They say they are flying away from dictatorship. But these people who are arriving in the coast of the United States, from Puerto Rico is not only 4,000, because the economic situation of our country is so bad that our population has reduced from 4 million to 3 million. And we are not a socialist countries, because it is the economic conditions of an economic in the Caribbean. And last, what mechanism from the diplomatic area for sovereign countries? We are not sovereign yet, but are there any diplomatic mechanisms to ask from the United States to eliminate Cuba from the list of countries who sponsor terrorism? As to these contrasts in the migratory aspect, and this has not been modified, there have been some announcements in the migratory. Now the United States have been opened their embassy. They are giving more visas, but no other country in the world has the so-called Cuban adjustment law. That is, this has not been modified with this recent measure. If you arrive in the United States, 1 year and 1 day later, you're given citizenship. Just if that law would be good for all the nationalities, then maybe the Cubans would be in very, very low numbers compared to other countries in the world. But the real cause for the impoverishment of people of the world is the nature of capitalism and imperialism and extortion and all the systems and the way in which they impose, with not very diplomatically, the international economic order. About terrorism, the Cuban embassy, we are developing a country that a tireless work to know the implications of including people in that list of sponsors of terrorism that goes beyond symbolic anything. This list has a connotation that is essentially financial. It is to have the right to impose their blockade on other countries that they don't have the right to do so. The inclusion of Cuba in this list gives them an unprecedented level, completely unjust level.
Sí, seguimos. Por acá nos habían pedido la palabra y creo que con esta
We
vamos
have
cerrando.
another question here,
Bueno, tenemos
and these
Clarisa y
two more questions, and then we're going to have lunch.
levantó la mano, no lo vimos. Que la levante. ¿Quién es?
Please raise your hand. My name is Clarisa Lopez. Clarisa Lopez. I am the daughter of Oscar Lopez Rivera. Very proud of it. For migratory reasons, I've been in the United States, but my father I live in Chicago, but my father is in Puerto Rico. With me my father is here. 50 years ago, in 1972, he founded the Cultural Center in Puerto Rico. It's a school that is still updated here. I am proud to continue his legacy, but I wanted to say is that this, for me, I wish you had much more time to continue talking about that, but I want to emphasize the solidarity, and we have to visibilize those who are not visible, like Puerto Rico and Cuba, because thanks to that is that we can visibilize the Cuban 5 case, for example, to transfer their voice and bring them here to Cuba. The same thing I did 36 years later with my dad, who was for 36 years in prison. I am 52, so there were over 40 years without him being near me. Now is that I had to go to the United States to work, to the United States, but hoping to go back to Puerto Rico at some point together with my dad and mom. But we have to take in our amazing, how can we increase this solidarity for Cuba? Those of us who have the possibility to do that, so that Cuba will enjoy. This blockade is so inhuman, not only Cuba, but other countries. Like I've been lucky to travel for many years under the so-called anti-terrorist law, and it was difficult for people. People would try to find you, and the embassies in different countries were waiting for me to escort me in airports because I was a non grata person. But this is not necessary at all. This is inhuman. I know what that is. So I demand, please, when you go back to your countries, to your committees, after you have seen the possibilities of this country, it's a country that, like any other country in the world, there are criticisms that we can make, but we have to go and look beyond all these criticism and be in solidarity with the Cuban cause. From Viva Fidel. Long live Fidel, long live the Cuban 5, long live Puerto Rico. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos por aquí.
El tema de la lista terrorista ya existe una carta de 18.
Thank you very much. There are 18 vice presidents and prime ministers from Latin America that have commented and paid respects and support us. Many friends from the United States. Thank you very much for that solidarity. Okay. Joanna, thank you very much. When you were making your presentation, I was thinking what were the problems that the blockade against Cuba and the blockade Cuba has suffered during these 60 years. And now the Venezuelan people is suffering the same. There are more than 926 measures against us are being implemented now, and there are no spare parts, supplies, raw materials, oil. We cannot make negotiations or business with other countries either. And those are resources that there are 30,000 million that have been stolen from us. The policy of the U.S. government against sovereign independent countries like Cuba and Venezuela shall generate a war campaign to denounce all over the world this kind of policy against our peoples, like the abduction of the Venezuelan plane in Argentina because a court in the United States said so. So we cannot transfer students to participate in competitions. We cannot transfer Cuban doctors. So I think we have to fight against those coercive measures and reclaim the support of the whole world to denounce this policy against humanity. We support and we urge you to continue doing that, and because this is an unsustainable policy, and I don't know, they can do that and attempt a coup d'etat against you, but that has people died because of that, and it costed you have to spend resources. These are policies to punish, and policies that have a purpose of domination. And it's not against human rights, it's against our resources. In the case of Venezuela, which is a rich country that has placed its resources available to Petrocaribe or in other countries and other peoples, public policies that are for the people, universities you open in Venezuela like we did in Cuba, and other peoples in Latin America that have more progressive processes now. So I support your motion, and we are brothers in this resistance, in the fight, and in the victory also. Thank you very much. Is there any other question specific? I remind you there's another session in the afternoon. Anyone? I think. Okay, so we close the session. Hi, my name is Elizabeth Sankara. I come with a delegation and we are organizing against the blockade in Miami. I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Boricua. And also want to say that on Sunday there will be the anniversary of 32 months of our fight against for the caravan to Cuba. We are in solidarity with the Cuban people. We are fighting, and we want to maybe educate people. I don't know if you have heard about this. There's another Puerto Rican, Ana Belén Montes, that was recently released from prison She's in Puerto Rico now, and she has taught me what we call solidarity in action. It's one thing is saying we are in solidarity with the Cuban people, and another thing is acting, making action in solidarity to eliminate this criminal, illegal, inhuman blockade against Cuba, which is not fighting in any other, it's not bombing any other people, any other country. This is a great challenge. My question is not for you, but for all of those who are present here, all those who want to fight against the blockade and put an end to the blockade. There are 185 countries that want to lift the blockade. If you want to organize, please contact me, and we are going to go ahead with this solidarity. This is something that has to end. That's the only thing that should be blocked in this world should be the imperialism. The world needs socialism. Cuba represents the rest, and is a proof that it is possible. It is possible. Thank you very much. Sorry, you can't hear. Joanna, please talk on the mic. Joanna, please talk to the mic. Can someone tell Joanna that please turn on the mic? Sorry, we can't hear the speaker. She's not, she hasn't turned on her mic. Sorry. Sorry. Thank you very much, Joanna. Thanks to all of you for participating and getting involved in the just cause of solidarity. I remind you that we will be back by 2:30 for a presentation by Raúl Capote, and you will be able to make questions, ask questions, and thank you.